everybody. I thought I'd come and do a recording about the white paper. It's not something I've spoken a lot on, but I am being asked questions about it. Now I can't tell you what's going to happen. I'll be honest with you. I can't tell you what decision's going to finally come out of it all. It is obviously clear from what the government are saying that decisions have already been made on some parts of it, but it's still not really clear on how that's going to look. Because obviously there's a big difference in there between what is being said quite often and how that looks and how that's interpreted and how that comes out, if you know what I mean. So, what I want to talk about is what I see. Some of the issues, some of the concerns I have around what is being suggested. Um, it's not going to be about everything. It's too long, too much to say it, to tell you about everything. But what I am going to tell you about is issues, concerns I have around some of it, how I feel that's going to affect, or, well, they're not going to affect, I can't predict that, but my thoughts around certain aspects of it, if that makes any sense at all. So some parts of it are interesting because they talk about early identification, recognition, early support. However, what I find interesting is that's not new. Our laws, our guidance around SEN and support already say that. Therefore, we should already be doing that. So although that is a positive, it's not really adding any more than what is already should be happening. And I say should because it never happens. We know that. They constantly don't do what they need to do. You know what I mean. So that, yep, 1 point. So yeah, like I said, that makes it look like a positive. However, that is already within our laws, within our guidance, and should already be happening. But it's constantly failed. It's constantly not happening. And this is where we start looking at, actually, is the laws themselves broken? Or is it the fact that the implementation doesn't happen, laws are not stuck to, therefore the actual process is broken? Because it's not adhered to and they're not held accountable to be adhered to. So yeah. Another point that they talk about is all staff across, so all teachers, all teaching assistants will be trained. Trained in what? I get trained to support SEN, but trained to support what in the SEN? SEN is such a broad, open topic that it's absolutely impossible to ensure all staff are trained in SEN. If we're talking about generic training, that is trying to be a one-size-fits-all, let's catch as many as we can kind of training, that's not going to work. All of our children are individualised, and if we look at, so for example, I've got 2 children. Both have similar profiles on paper. So on paper, they have the same diagnosis. So what is suggested for them generically is the same. However, in reality, in practice, they're very different how they present. How it affects their life is different. So one thing to think about is when we look at diagnosis, when we look at medical letters and when we look at reports, they go off a diagnosis, how that could affect them and how they could present, yeah? However, what we don't often highlight and what is not seen, and this poses a problem across all areas from EHCPs, PIP, DLA and everything, is how very different our presentations can be from person to person and how our differences impact our lives varies dramatically from person to person. And that is the issue. If we're going to do generic training across the board, we are going to miss supporting more people than we are going to actually support, because it's extremely rare that 2 people are the same. Therefore, without any clarification on what their expectation is around the training, how it's going to be implemented and how that is going to support our children, It's just words, it doesn't mean anything. Another point to look at, we talk about things like zones of regulation, visuals, PECs, but what we tend to find is them kind of strategies are put into plans, yeah? They're often deemed as ordinary available provision quite a lot of the time nowadays, and they're often deemed as generic strategies that all staff members across education should have understanding to implement. Now, what I see quite often is what they've been taught to do or how they're used is not necessarily how they should be used. So, for example, visuals used in a timetable or visuals of tasks, what's going to come next, etc., are used and are there to support children to have that visual understanding of the routine and what's next. Some classrooms you tend to find visuals are being used for stuff like sit down with your legs crossed, eyes on the teacher. That is a control mechanism. That's not what visuals are there for. They're not there to control a person's behaviour and action, especially not when we're looking at children with ADHD, children with autism, children with different profiles where it can be painful to look at the person. It can be painful for them to sit down with the legs crossed and stay still. We need to make sure that whatever visuals we're putting in place are not to control that person and stop what traits they have because of the differences, but are there to support that person and that young child and that young person to be able to be included within the classroom environment in a way that works for them. And this is what I think is the massive, gap, if you understand what I mean. What we still vary to, what we're still, especially in a mainstream environment, we do, is advice and information is written in a lot of the contexts. Not everybody does it. We definitely have more and more neurodivergent friendly wording coming out. However, we're still stuck behind that medical model, and that medical model gives you strategies that are more around compliance to what your expectations are, or to what a teacher's or a classroom's or a school's expectations are, rather than allowing or adjusting them expectations to allow that child to actually feel safe and confident within that environment to where they are regulated to engage. And I think that's what's missing. And without the right support around all of this training that they speak of, and around the right training, not just generic training or training that doesn't fully explore and explain how it needs to be impacted, then we need, then we're going to have and continue to have a bigger problem than what we even have now. It's just going to get worse. Another thing, like zones of regulation, okay? What it tends to do is you end up with a visual in the class, yeah, with all of the kids' names on it, or pictures, or whatever symbol they've got for themselves on this, with the 4 colours, yeah? So, kids, in particular SEND kids, might not understand what green, what red, what yellow, or what blue specifically relates to, yeah? What a lot of people are using it for, and what a lot of kids end up doing, would be to put themselves in green because the teacher wants them to be happy, or put themselves in green because they don't want people to think that they are being naughty, even though that's not what it means, but that's their perception of it. When it's used and it's not fully explored, and the understanding of emotions and what each of those colour brackets mean to each individual child, because remember, it's not generic either. Every single colour bracket is going to be something different to each child. What makes me happy doesn't make everybody else happy. What makes me regulated doesn't make everybody else regulated. What works today doesn't necessarily work tomorrow. So unless there's that understanding of that fluidity, then it's not going to work. If we've just got a set model even if we've individualised it to each child, if we are put out, for example, if they're in blue because they're feeling sad and we need, sometimes when they're sad, if they take a 5 minute, movement break, that helps them to regulate again and feel a bit more happier. And we just put that down as a general strategy. So every time they're sad, we're giving them, they're being pushed to do that movement break. However, today, they feel sad, and that movement break's not enough to regulate them because the sadness is a bit deeper than what it would be. Then, and what we have out and what we've developed doesn't actually reflect that forever changing dynamic, then it's not going to work and it's not going to support. And then you've got people going, we do zones of regulation, we have it in class, it's the thingy, but they don't access it, they don't do it. And it's because the child or the young person has got to the stage where actually what's on that particular zones of regulation or whatever's been decided in that plan at this time is not working, and it's that understanding of development as well, because as we grow, as our children and young people grow, as our hormones shift, even throughout the month, for example, especially when they're in puberty and hormones are changing drastically, what we need to regulate, what we need to survive and cope changes massively and drastically. Our capacity changes drastically, and this also applies into, as an example, when a woman has a forever changing cycle because of periods, menstruation and all that kind of stuff, which affects our hormones. We have dips, we have highs, etc. across the month. We tend to find that we feel more of our neurodivergent traits a lot more intense, during a particular part of the month because of that. And even though men don't have menstruation cycles, they still have an hormone cycle as well. And it's the same for our children. We all have that hormone cycle. We all have that hormone shift that affects our ability, affects our capacity, and that changes day to day on what we need for regulation. And we have all of that understanding incorporated into it to make those adjustments, make those allowances, and to alter and to be able to work on the fly, so to speak, be able to actually read the situation in that moment. Zones of regulation doesn't work. It's too generic. It's not. It's a kind of, and it is a big system. It's a very complex system as well. But without all that complexity behind it, and without having all of that detail, then it's not. It's too generic, if that makes sense. And that's quite often why a lot of people now move away from the likes of zones of regulations, because for our children and young people it's too much of a complex system to understand. And to be able to actually use that, there's got to be quite the understanding of our own inner emotions and how each month, each day, what capacity we've got, how we're feeling, what is it that's affecting us, and quite a lot of our young people and children don't have that capacity. I'm 39 years old and I would say I'm just about at the stage where I'm getting to grips with what it is that affects me. It's like, for example, when my menstruation cycle, when I'm due my period, the week leading, well, I'd say the week, yeah, it is a week leading up to it, and the first 2 or 3 days, I'm past it. My anxiety is off the charts. Nothing can help me. My capacity is minus, if I'm honest. I'm really, really struggling. My demands are like, oh my god. My ability to communicate is worse than ever. My ability to word find is worse than ever. I find myself frustrated, angry and upset really, really easily. It only takes the smallest little thing, and that is because of the hormone shift. Once I've actually finished my period, a couple of days after that, for about a week, 2 weeks at the most, I find myself where I'm actually firing on all guns, where I am the most regulated that I'm ever going to be. I feel the most put together. I'm not saying my neurodivergent traits aren't there. I'm not saying I don't worry and my anxiety isn't high, because it still is. But it's my best peak time of regulation and capacity, and it's because my hormones are at that optimal point that works for my body. And it's so important that we start to understand that, but it's so complex and difficult to understand that our young children, young people, our children, even into the 20s, a lot of people still massively struggle that, and it takes a lot of growing up, aging, understanding, and getting to know yourself and understanding how your brain works to be able to get to a stage where you start to recognise all that. And some people don't even get to that stage, they're unable to get to that stage, and that's okay. But as people around them, we need to understand all of this, and we need to understand what it is that affects us in those areas and in those departments, and what it is that our young people and young people and children, are going through. So although they are not adults, they still have hormone cycles. They still have times of the month where their hormones are at that peak time and they're doing great. And then they have times of their months where the hormones have shifted again and they're feeling at their lowest. And in particular, especially when we're coming towards puberty, we see that shift more and more as they change and they grow, and as the hormones come to them peak times and their hormones are changing to allow for that growth into adulthood. And that's what it is. So sometimes it might feel like, actually, we've had a great week. This is fantastic, we've had a great week. Next week's been really bad and you don't know why it's sunk, and you don't know, you're looking for triggers and you can't really find triggers, and you're finding that every single little thing's kicking them off, and we look for environmental triggers and we look for strategies to help support them, and that's great, fantastic, and we're always going to constantly do that. But we also need to be aware that actually it just could be a bad week. It could be that their hormone levels have shifted into this point where they're feeling really low, they're really struggling. There's no rhyme, no reason about it. There's nothing big drastic that's happened per se. It's just internal. It's internal within our bodies that our hormones have dropped to this point that actually today's just a bad day. There's not any specific explanation. Nobody's done nothing, nothing's happened, nothing in the environment. So we're all sat there like, oh God, what's happened? We can't figure this out. Everything was all right last week, and in school they're going, nothing's happened, we don't get it. But that's the point. You can't see what's happened because the shift's in here. The shift is the hormones. And I think that's where my concern about generic training comes in, because generic training, and I know I've gone off on a tangent there, sorry, but that's me, me, I yabber on about things, but generic training doesn't allow for all of that thought process. And I think that is an area massively that we need to grow on. And I think that's an area that's massively misunderstood. And I think that is another area there that could help a lot of neurodivergent people with whatever profile they got, because our hormones, our internalisation, are the things that happen within our body. It's a major part of it all, and we don't have control over it. We can't stop it. We can't, there's sometimes where we end up going to the doctors because we have that persistent lowness that we're not bouncing back from at certain periods. So then we know the hormone imbalance is wrong and needs help to be corrected. Now, when you look at the fact that we fluctuate constantly anyway with hormones, that is going to continue to affect us at different points of the month, and it's just not something we control, and we've got to allow ourselves and understand that actually I'm at that stage now. My hormone cycle must be at that point where it's dipped. I'm really struggling. I can't control it. There's nothing I can do about it. I need to be kind to myself. I need to do the things that I need to do to regulate, and that is okay. And if it means I can't get as much work done today than I would like to do, or I can't engage in something in school that I normally would be able to, we've got to accept that's okay, that's fine. And that is the only time it's going to all work, is when we start accepting these things are happening. This is why we're struggling. We're all very different, and how this looks for every single individual person is different. Therefore, generic training, as they're proposing across the whole of England, isn't going to be helpful. Yes, you might catch somebody and it might be helpful for a couple of people, but on the whole, there's still going to be that giant black hole that kids are sucked into because it's not foolproof. Like it's being made out to sound like it is. It's not. You know, there's a lot more things to go into, and I have decided personally what I am going to start trying to do is educating more around the hormone dips, the difference in capacity, you know, the regulation, how it's not all just environmental, somebody's done something, or an external factor, on how much of a big part our internal factors place on how our digestion, our hormones, you know, how we feel, how our body is, if we're in pain, all of that builds up the picture of capacity, and that's what needs to be understood, I think, anyway. And I'm aware I've gone off on a tangent. I'm supposed to be speaking about which I do think I am talking about that, because what I see right now is them trying to build a generic model to pigeonhole children into specific points, and saying that person's got this profile, therefore they need that support. That is a dangerous and such a disaster. That is the worst thing they could ever do, because every person's individual and what kind of support they need varies massively. And it's not until we start treating people individually that things are going to change. And it's the same with safety. And I've got a massive thing at the moment with safety. What people need to understand is, for us to have capacity, for us to be in that optimal state, to be able to regulate and feel like we can engage and do things, we need to feel safe. When we mention the word safety, people automatically go, oh my God, they are safe. Nothing's going to happen to them in school. They're not going to get hurt. This is not going to happen. Misunderstanding what they mean, what we mean. So what we need to understand is, in particular, especially around PDA children and significant anxiety, is that the crux of the issue is that our brains are on fret all the time. They don't stop feeling that they need to be alert. They're always on alert, looking for threats to protect us, because our brains very easily feel unsafe. And that is why PDA children look for control, because the easiest way to feel more safe is to feel like you've got control, because you're in control in your environment, you're controlling what you're doing, you're stopping as much as possible anything bad happening. And you need to understand that threats to safety could be a simple misunderstanding of a conversation. It could be that there is something in the environment that's new and they're unsure of. It is the fear of the unknown, but built up from little things, not always necessarily what other people would see as threats to safety. So most of the general population that don't have the difficulties around PDA, anxiety, etc., would feel safe if they were at risk of being hurt, you know, weapons. They would feel unsafe with violence, that kind of stuff. However, for people like me, people with profiles, anxiety that's severe, and PDA in particular, safety threats come from all over the place. Like I said, upsetting somebody makes me feel unsafe. You know, the fear of the unknown makes me feel unsafe. And when I say the fear of the unknown, it is not knowing a person, not knowing an environment, never been somewhere before. Even if it's somebody where it looks super exciting and I really want to do, because it creates that sense of unsafety, because I've never been there before, I don't know what to expect, and there's that great huge fear of the unknown. It's a threat to me, and it removes that sense of safety from me. So what we need to do instead, when people are trying to explain that a child or a young person in an environment is not feeling safe, is not jump to a conclusion that you are being accused of something drastic happening, because that's not what we're saying. What we're trying to understand and explain to you how that child's feeling, how that child perceives their sense of safety, and what it is that makes them feel unsafe. Anyway, I've jabbered on for 24 minutes already. I will come back and do more videos about bits and pieces of the white paper. as it pops into my head, because that's what I do. I've covered a couple of points today. I was hoping to cover more, but I keep going off on a tangent because that's where my passion lies. And this is where I'm hoping to develop some form of training videos, webinars, etc. going forward to inform what I think, what I feel and what I see from what I work at, but more importantly, what I see from what I live. So what I talk about, what I say, what I do and how it affects me comes from living with the difficulties that I live with. And I think massively that's what we need to sort of spin on its head a bit, is understanding that medicalised way of looking at things is not going to support the lived experience, and we need to start supporting the lived experience more. Thanks, bye.